I'm not sure when the strangeness started exactly, but I remember that first shift when I began to notice the signs, the flickers in the corner of my eye, the faint smell of smoke even when there was none, and that feeling that crawled up the back of my neck like someone was watching me. That's how it was most nights here. On the outside, the building was just another corporate tower. Nothing fancy, a bit outdated, with a parking lot and a stale-smelling lobby. But at night, the place transformed. It was just me, my colleague Ben, and the hollow, fluorescent-lit hallways stretching endlessly, echoing every small sound. We were guards, tasked with watching over a few dozen floors of empty offices, unremarkable rooms with lifeless cubicles. We'd do rounds every few hours, walk up and down the quiet floors, scan a badge at various checkpoints, and repeat. And repeat. Ben was an old-timer, someone who had been doing night shifts long enough to carry a kind of quiet resentment toward the job. He didn't talk much, and I never asked him much either. But there was a look in his eyes, something that told me he knew things I didn't about the building, things he wouldn't share, even if I asked. I tried to shrug it off as just his tiredness. But the longer I worked those nights, the more I began to feel it myself. One night in particular sticks out, like a stain I can't quite clean from my memory. The building felt different that night somehow. Colder. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and every small sound seemed amplified, from the hum of the fluorescent lights to the soft creaks in the walls. Ben and I split our rounds as usual. He took the lower floors, while I worked my way through the upper levels. We hardly ever crossed paths except for a few passing nods in the break room. But that night, he'd stopped me before I took the elevator up. "You seeing anything strange tonight?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I laughed it off, saying, "Just the usual, empty desks and stale coffee." But he didn't smile. He just looked past me, his eyes distant, as if he were remembering something he'd rather forget. "If you see anything tonight, just stay calm. Could just be nothing." It was odd for Ben to say something like that, but I brushed it off. I figured he was just messing with me or trying to make conversation. Maybe he was just bored. Or maybe he was serious, and I just didn't want to believe him. I took the elevator up, the fluorescent lights casting a dull glow on the walls as I made my way to the 12th floor. This floor always gave me a strange feeling. The hallway stretched long and dark, only the exit signs at the ends casting red halos. The offices felt tighter up here, claustrophobic, with their cubicles packed in close like sardines. As I did my rounds, I started noticing something strange. My footsteps echoed back at me a split second late, as if the building was absorbing the sound and then spitting it back out, distorted. It made me feel like someone was right behind me, stepping in time with each footfall. I stopped and listened, holding my breath, trying to catch anything out of place. But there was only silence, the kind of silence that presses on your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. I continued feeling ridiculous for being on edge, but as I moved through each checkpoint, the feeling grew stronger. The floors creaked a little louder, and every time I turned a corner, I thought I saw a shadow slip just out of sight. At one point, I found myself in the far end of the floor, near a row of old file cabinets. They were hardly used anymore, the kind of office furniture that was more relic than utility. I leaned in to scan my badge, and that's when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible noise like whispering. I froze. The sound was coming from the end of the hallway near the storage room. It was too faint to make out any words, but it was unmistakable. Someone was speaking, their voice low and hurried, like they didn't want to be heard. I was alone on that floor. I knew I was. Ben was downstairs. My heart pounded, a strange mix of curiosity and fear pulling me forward. I stepped down the hallway, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I pushed on. The sound grew louder as I approached the storage room door, its metal handle cold under my hand. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside was darkness, thick and oppressive. The single bulb in the room flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. and just as quickly as it had started, the whispering stopped, leaving me standing there in a thick silence. Nothing. No one was there. Just empty shelves and the dusty smell of old paper. My breath came in shallow, uneasy gasps. I backed out slowly, my skin prickling as if something were watching me. I could feel it, that same chill on the back of my neck that never seemed to leave me these days. I made my way back to the main hallway, shaking off the feeling. Just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. I'd been working too many nights. I was letting the darkness get to me. But as I passed the row of cubicles, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There, on one of the desks, was a coffee mug, still steaming, its contents freshly poured. I hadn't made any coffee. Ben was downstairs. No one else was supposed to be here. My mind reeled. It was impossible. I hadn't seen anyone else come up. I hadn't heard the elevator. I walked toward the mug, half expecting it to disappear, to be some mirage conjured by my own mind. But it was real, as solid and warm as my own hand. The name Ben was written on the side in faded marker. I glanced around, my gaze darting from one shadowed corner to the next. Had Ben come up here without me noticing? Was he trying to mess with me, to scare me? I picked up my radio, my voice a little shakier than I intended. "Ben, you up here?" There was a long pause, and then his voice crackled through, thick with static. "No, I'm on the 5th floor. Why?" I swallowed, staring at the mug in my hand. My pulse raced as I tried to make sense of it. "No reason," I lied, setting the mug back down. "Just thought I heard something." Another pause. "Stay alert. I'll finish up down here and meet you on the main floor." I let the radio drop back to my side, feeling a chill seep into my bones. I finished the last few checkpoints in a hurry, the eerie silence pressing in on me like a weight. Every step felt heavier, every shadow longer. By the time I reached the elevator, my nerves were frayed, my mind reeling with unanswered questions. When I finally made it back to the main floor, Ben was waiting for me, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask about the mug, didn't ask what had me so rattled. He just gave me a long, searching look, as if he knew something I didn't. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the building pressing down on us. "You ever feel like there's something else here?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. Ben didn't answer at first. He just stared off into the distance, his gaze dark and distant. "Sometimes," he said quietly. "Sometimes I feel like this building remembers, like it knows us, even when we don't want it to." I laughed nervously, but there was no humor in it. His words lingered, wrapping around my mind like a cold shroud. That night, when I finally clocked out and walked into the cold dawn air, I swore I'd never come back. But as I got into my car, a strange thought occurred to me, one I couldn't shake. In the passenger seat, just where Ben would have sat, was a coffee mug. It was mine this time, the one I'd left on the break room counter. I sat there staring at the mug like it held some unspoken answer. I hadn't touched it since I clocked in. I knew I hadn't. I'd left it in the break room, untouched and cold. And now here it was, waiting for me like it had just been poured. The heat of it seemed to seep into my hand as I picked it up, its warmth an accusation I couldn't ignore. My heart pounded as I glanced back at the building, its tall, dark silhouette looming in the early morning fog. Part of me wanted to throw the mug out the window, to never look back, but some instinct kept me rooted in place. It was the feeling that I had left something behind, or maybe that something had been left with me. That entire day, I couldn't shake the sense that something had followed me home. It was subtle at first, that creeping paranoia at the edge of my vision. The feeling of being watched grew stronger in my tiny apartment as night approached. I kept glancing at the coffee mug, where I'd set it on the kitchen counter. Every time I passed by, I felt as though the air around it shifted, like it was pulling at something inside me. I didn't sleep well, and when I finally did, my dreams were muddled, fragmented glimpses of dark hallways and whispering voices. I woke drenched in sweat, Still, something pulled me back to the building the next night. I tried to focus on my routine, on the repetitive tasks of clocking in, the badge scans, the hollow echo of my footsteps. But the building felt alive somehow, as if it had eyes fixed on me. Every hum of the air conditioning, every creak of the walls sounded louder, as though they were trying to tell me something. I forced myself to think it was just the fatigue. Ben was waiting at the front desk, his usual stoic look giving way to something I couldn't quite read. There was a new weight in his eyes, a tiredness that mirrored my own. "Rough night?" he asked, not meeting my gaze. "Yeah," I mumbled. "Rough day, too." He didn't ask for details and I didn't offer any, but as the night stretched on, I noticed him glancing at me from time to time, his expression cautious, almost worried. During my first round on the upper floors, the silence felt oppressive, more intense than the previous night. The hallway lights flickered as I passed, casting long shadows that stretched toward me. I found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there just out of reach, watching. Then as I neared the 12th floor, I heard it again, the faint sound of whispering. It was the same hurried, urgent tone as before, but this time it was closer, almost as if it were waiting for me. My hands felt clammy as I clenched the radio, debating whether to call Ben or investigate on my own. I crept forward, the whispers growing louder, leading me down a hallway I'd walked 100 times. The sound guided me past rows of cubicles, past empty desks, and toward the storage room at the far end. The door was ajar and a faint light flickered inside. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, but something, a morbid curiosity maybe, pushed me forward. As I stepped into the room, the light above sputtered and went dark. I stood in pitch-black silence, my breath hitching as the whispers died out, leaving me alone with nothing but my own panicked heartbeat. I fumbled for my flashlight, flicking it on and sweeping it around the room. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but dusty shelves and forgotten office supplies. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A coffee mug, identical to the one I'd found in my car, sat on the edge of an old filing cabinet, steam curling from its surface. But this one, it wasn't mine. It wasn't Ben's either. It was plain, unmarked, yet somehow familiar, as though it had always been there, watching, waiting. I took a step forward, my hand reaching out involuntarily, but as my fingers brushed the ceramic, the room suddenly felt wrong, like I was trespassing, like I'd crossed some invisible line I shouldn't have. The air grew dense, suffocating, pressing in around me. A sudden crash behind me made me jump, my flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. I spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing, just darkness, swallowing me whole. The whispers started up again, louder, closer, echoing in the empty room, their words indistinct but carrying a sense of urgency, of warning. "Ben?" I called, my voice barely a whisper. Nothing. I stumbled back, my hand brushing the wall as I felt my way out of the storage room and back into the hallway. The mug was still clutched in my other hand, its warmth now cold and lifeless. I hurried back to the elevator, breathing hard, desperate to get out of there. When the doors finally opened, I nearly ran inside, jabbing the button for the ground floor. When I reached the lobby, Ben was waiting. His face was paler than usual, his gaze fixed on something behind me as I stumbled out of the elevator. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice barely audible. I looked down, realizing I was still holding the coffee mug from the storage room. Its surface was coated in a fine layer of dust, as though it had been sitting there for years. I didn't remember picking it up, didn't remember bringing it with me. "Ben, I found this up there," I stammered, holding it out to him. He stared at it, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. That's not mine," he murmured, almost to himself. "But I've seen it before. I saw it in the break room. Years ago, back when I first started." A cold sweat ran down my back as he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "That mug, it belonged to another guard. He went missing, just disappeared one night during his rounds. They said he just walked out, left without a trace. But some of us, we know better. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What happened to him? Ben's gaze drifted past me, toward the hallway leading back to the floors above. I think he's still here, he said quietly. I think he's part of this place now. Trapped, just like the rest of us. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. I looked down at the mug in my hand, the faded dust clinging to it like an accusation. It felt wrong, like I was holding on to something I didn't understand, something that belonged to someone else, someone who had never truly left. The next morning, as I left the building, I saw a single mug sitting on the dashboard of my car. I hadn't put it there. I'd left it inside. My stomach twisted as I realized that it wasn't just the building that wouldn't let go. I could feel it now, a strange heaviness that followed me even in the daylight, in the comfort of my own home. It was a weight that stayed with me, a presence lurking just beyond the edges of my sight, waiting, watching, and whispering. I'm still working the night shift, of course. It's part of me now, a routine I can't seem to break. But every time I step into that building, every time I hear the faint murmur of voices, I wonder, how much of me is still mine? And how much has already been claimed?